The Battle of Lepanto in 1571 shattered centuries of Ottoman naval dominance and marked the last great clash of galleys in Mediterranean history. Fought off the coast of western Greece, this confrontation between the Christian Holy League and the Ottoman Empire was more than a military engagement. It was a test of empires, religions, and reputations. The Ottoman fleet, long feared as an unstoppable maritime force, had expanded relentlessly through the eastern Mediterranean, threatening Venetian ports and claiming Cyprus. To counter this, a rare alliance of European powers formed under Pope Pius V, uniting Spanish, Venetian, and Papal forces in an ambitious campaign. Commanded by Don John of Austria, the Holy League's armada confronted the Ottoman fleet led by Ali Pasha near the Gulf of Patras. Both sides brought massive fleets, totaling over 400 ships and 150,000 men. But this was more than a contest of numbers. It was a collision of military cultures. The Christian fleet relied heavily on firepower, deploying ships with more cannons and using newer tactics. The Ottomans favored speed and close-quarters combat, relying on their elite boarding troops to overwhelm opponents. As the sun rose on October 7th, the fleets closed in. Cannons thundered, archers fired, ships collided with brutal force. Amid the chaos, Don John's center broke through the Ottoman line. Ali Pasha's flagship was boarded and, after fierce resistance, captured. His fall sent shockwaves through the Ottoman ranks. The Christian forces pressed their advantage, pushing the Ottomans into retreat. By day's end, more than half the Ottoman fleet had been lost or captured. The result was a resounding victory for the Holy League and a psychological blow to the Ottoman Empire. Though the Ottomans would rebuild their navy within a few years, they would never again hold the same dominance at sea. For Europe, Lepanto became a symbol of resistance and unity, a rare moment when fractured Christian powers worked together to halt imperial expansion.
The Battle of Breitenfeld in 1631 transformed the course of the 30 Years' War and established Sweden as a formidable European power. This wasn't just a military turning point, it was a moment when the very structure of warfare began to shift. The conflict itself had already ravaged much of Central Europe, with Catholic Habsburg forces attempting to crush Protestant resistance. Cities were burned, armies foraged through farmlands, and civilians suffered endlessly. When the Swedish king Gustavus Adolphus landed on the continent, few expected the small northern kingdom to redefine the balance of power. As imperial Catholic forces, led by General Tilly, pressed into Saxony, they encountered an allied army composed of Swedish troops and local Protestant militias. Near the village of Breitenfeld, in what is now Germany, the two sides met on September 17, 1631. On paper, the Catholic side had the advantage, battle-hardened troops, strong cavalry, and a tradition of victory, but the Swedes introduced something new: disciplined, mobile infantry formations and a deep integration of artillery across the battlefield. Gustavus Adolphus revolutionized how armies moved and fought. His troops operated in smaller, flexible units rather than dense blocks, allowing for greater maneuverability. His artillery wasn't just parked at the rear, it moved with the infantry, providing continuous support. As the battle unfolded, Tilly's army struck first, hammering the Saxon flank and driving it into retreat. But instead of collapsing, the Swedes pivoted. They filled the gap, held firm, and launched coordinated counterattacks that began to tear through the Catholic lines. By late afternoon, momentum had clearly shifted. The Swedish right flank overwhelmed the imperial left, artillery pounded retreating troops, and the once confident Habsburg forces disintegrated. The battlefield was littered with broken pikes, discarded weapons, and exhausted survivors. The victory at Breitenfeld shattered the myth of Catholic invincibility and breathed new life into the Protestant cause. More importantly, it marked the arrival of Sweden as a great military innovator. Gustavus Adolphus earned a reputation as one of the most forward-thinking commanders of his time, and his strategies would influence European warfare for decades. Breitenfeld wasn't just a battle won, it was a style of war reborn.
The Battle of Poltava in 1709 was the decisive blow that ended Sweden's ambitions as a European superpower and launched Russia onto the world stage. At the dawn of the 18th century, Sweden, under King Charles XII, had dominated Northern Europe, its military feared across the continent. But when Charles set his sights on the vast lands of the Russian Empire, he found himself entangled in a war of attrition, distance, and weather that would ultimately unravel his empire. The Great Northern War had been raging for nearly a decade when Charles led his army deep into Ukraine, aiming to deliver a knockout strike against Tsar Peter the Great. But Russia's strategy didn't rely on open confrontation. It relied on space and time. As the Swedes advanced, Russian forces withdrew, burning crops and destroying supply routes. By the time Charles reached Poltava, his army was starving, outnumbered, and weakened by months of exposure to brutal conditions. Still, on June 28, 1709, Charles attempted to break the siege around Poltava and regain the initiative. Due to a prior injury, he could not lead the charge himself and had to rely on subordinates. The Swedish assault began before dawn, targeting a series of fortified Russian redoubts. But confusion set in. Some commanders hesitated. Units lost cohesion. The initial momentum faltered, and Russian defenders held firm. Peter the Great, eager to test the reforms he'd imposed on his military, launched a full-scale counterattack. Russian infantry, once considered second-rate, fought with discipline and organization. Artillery pounded Swedish positions. Cavalry flanked from both sides. Within hours, the once dominant Swedish force was surrounded and disintegrating. Charles fled south with a small contingent, seeking refuge in the Ottoman Empire, while the core of his army was captured or scattered. Poltava marked a stunning reversal of fortune. Sweden's age of imperial dominance ended in a single day, and Russia's began. Peter the Great would go on to modernize his country further, founding St. Petersburg as a window to the West and expanding Russian influence into European affairs. The balance of power had shifted, and Europe would never be the same. Poltava wasn't just a military defeat for Sweden, it was the final act of an overextended empire confronting the limits of ambition in a land that refused to play by old rules. The Battle of Plassey in 1757 transformed a trading company into a colonial empire and marked the beginning of British dominance in India. At the time, the British East India Company was just one of several European powers vying for influence on the subcontinent, competing with the French and operating under the favor of local rulers. But tensions in Bengal, a wealthy and strategically critical province, set the stage for a confrontation that would shift the future of South Asia. The spark came when Siraj-ud-Dowlah, the Nawab of Bengal, seized the British stronghold at Calcutta in retaliation for the company's unauthorized fortifications. The incident, known for the infamous Black Hole of Calcutta, pushed the British into a full-scale military response. Robert Clive, a company officer with a reputation for boldness, led a small force from Madras to Bengal to reclaim British positions and assert dominance. Clive faced overwhelming odds. Siraj's army was vast, reportedly numbering over 50,000 troops, while Clive had just over 3,000. But the British strategy didn't hinge on numbers, it relied on manipulation. Clive exploited divisions within the Nawab's court, forging secret agreements with key commanders who resented Siraj's rule. Chief among them was Mir Jafar, a general promised power in exchange for betrayal. On June 23, 1757, the two sides met on the banks of the Bhagirathi River near the village of Plassey. The battlefield was soaked from monsoon rains and the air thick with tension. The Nawab's army opened with cannon fire, but coordination quickly unraveled. Mir Jafar and other commanders held their troops back, honoring their secret deal with the British. Clive's men, disciplined and well-armed, pressed forward methodically. Despite their small numbers, they created the illusion of overwhelming confidence. By afternoon, the Nawab's army began to retreat in confusion. Siraj-ud-Dowlah fled, only to be captured later by his former allies. Clive installed Mir Jafar as a puppet ruler and ensured British control over Bengal's treasury and administration. Plassey was not a grand battle in the traditional sense. It was brief, politically charged, and rooted in betrayal. But its impact was monumental. It marked the moment the East India Company transitioned from merchant to monarch, laying the foundation for nearly 2 centuries of British rule in India. Wealth from Bengal flooded into company coffers, financing further conquests and reshaping British global ambitions.
The Battle of Saratoga in 1777 was the moment the American Revolution went from a desperate colonial rebellion to a legitimate war for independence. At a time when the Continental Army was struggling for supplies, morale, and recognition, this battle provided more than just a victory. It secured the international alliance that would make independence possible. Until then, Britain had assumed the rebellion could be crushed with overwhelming force. Saratoga shattered that illusion. The British plan in 1777 aimed to split the rebellious colonies in 2. General John Burgoyne would lead a large army south from Canada through upstate New York, linking up with British forces moving up the Hudson River from New York City. But the plan quickly began to unravel. Terrain was slow, American militias harassed the supply lines, and expected reinforcements never arrived. By the time Burgoyne reached Saratoga, he was isolated and deep in hostile territory. American forces under General Horatio Gates and the fiery Benedict Arnold had built strong defensive positions on the high ground. Burgoyne launched several attacks in September and October, hoping to break through and push south, but the Americans held firm. Arnold, though sidelined by Gates, took to the battlefield anyway and led a daring counterattack that broke British lines and forced them back. Days later, surrounded and with no path of escape, Burgoyne surrendered his entire army. The British defeat at Saratoga stunned Europe. Until that point, many foreign powers, particularly France, had been reluctant to openly support the American cause. But Saratoga proved the revolution had real staying power. Just months later, France formally entered the war as an American ally, bringing with it ships, soldiers, and supplies the young republic desperately needed. Spain and the Dutch Republic would follow suit in supporting the fight against Britain. Beyond its strategic and diplomatic consequences, Saratoga was a powerful morale booster. It showed that a poorly equipped, improvised army could outmaneuver and defeat one of the world's most powerful militaries. It gave the revolution a sense of inevitability, and it showed that the war would no longer be a local rebellion. It had become a global conflict.
The Battle of Leipzig in 1813, often called the Battle of Nations, was the largest military confrontation in Europe prior to World War I and marked the beginning of the end for Napoleon Bonaparte's empire. After years of sweeping victories that extended French dominance across the continent, Napoleon's luck had begun to unravel. His disastrous Russian campaign left his Grande Armée decimated, and a coalition of European powers, Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Sweden, seized the moment to strike. Napoleon, unwilling to relinquish control, regrouped in Germany and tried to reassert his grip on Central Europe. But his forces were stretched thin, and many of his allies had defected. By October 1813, near the Saxon city of Leipzig, he faced a massive Allied army numbering more than 300,000 troops, nearly double the size of his own. The battle began on October 16th and stretched over 4 brutal days. Napoleon launched a series of aggressive attacks, hoping to break the coalition before they could fully concentrate their strength. His men fought fiercely, holding off superior numbers and attempting to fracture the Allied coordination. But the coalition armies, though from different nations, had learned from past defeats. They moved deliberately, coordinated effectively, and steadily encircled Napoleon's position. On October 18th, the tide turned decisively. The coalition launched a full-scale assault from multiple fronts. Prussian, Austrian, Russian, and Swedish forces pressed in, tightening the noose. French positions crumbled. A key bridge over the Elster River, critical for retreat, was blown too early, stranding thousands of French troops. In the chaos, many were captured, wounded, or swept into the river. Napoleon narrowly escaped with what remained of his army. The defeat at Leipzig shattered the aura of invincibility that had surrounded Napoleon for over a decade. German states that had once supported him began defecting to the coalition. France itself was now exposed, and just months later, coalition forces would invade and occupy Paris. Napoleon was forced to abdicate in 1814 and was exiled to Elba, though he would briefly return before his final fall at Waterloo. Leipzig wasn't just a military loss, it was a symbolic collapse of an entire imperial project. It showed that no matter how brilliant a commander might be, no empire could survive the weight of Europe united against it.
The Battle of Gettysburg in 1863 was the pivotal moment of the American Civil War, the point at which the tide irreversibly turned against the Confederacy. After 2 years of bitter fighting, Confederate General Robert E. Lee had brought his army north into Union territory, hoping to strike a psychological and strategic blow. His goal was to break Northern morale, possibly force European recognition of the Confederacy, and pressure the Union into peace talks. What followed instead was a 3-day clash that would become the bloodiest battle ever fought on American soil. It began on July 1st as Confederate forces collided with Union cavalry near the small Pennsylvania town of Gettysburg. Reinforcements from both sides poured in, and the battle grew rapidly in scale. By the end of the first day, Confederate troops had pushed Union defenders through the town and onto the high ground south of it. But instead of continuing the attack, Lee paused, allowing the Union Army under General George Meade to dig in and fortify key positions on Cemetery Ridge and other elevated terrain. Over the next 2 days, Lee attempted to dislodge the Union defenders with repeated assaults on both flanks. Fierce fighting erupted at places like Little Round Top, the Wheatfield, and Devil's Den. Despite brave efforts and staggering casualties, Confederate forces failed to break the Union lines. Then, on July 3rd, Lee made a fateful decision. He ordered a frontal assault directly at the center of the Union position, a move that would become known as Pickett's Charge. It was a gamble born from desperation. Nearly 12,000 Confederate soldiers advanced across open fields under relentless artillery and rifle fire. The charge briefly pierced the Union line but quickly collapsed under overwhelming resistance. The attacking force was decimated. As survivors staggered back to their own lines, it was clear the attack had failed catastrophically. Gettysburg ended with Lee's retreat back to the south and Meade's decision not to pursue. Though the war would continue for nearly 2 more years, the Confederacy would never again launch a major offensive into Union territory. The myth of Confederate invincibility was shattered. The battle didn't just alter military momentum, it redefined the war itself. Weeks later, President Lincoln would travel to the site and deliver the Gettysburg Address, framing the conflict as a struggle not just for Union, but for the enduring principles of democracy and equality.
The First Battle of the Marne in 1914 stopped what could have been a rapid German victory in World War I and ensured the conflict would descend into years of brutal trench warfare. In the opening weeks of the war, Germany's high command launched the Schlieffen Plan, a bold strategy to sweep through neutral Belgium, crush France in the west, and then pivot east to confront Russia. The plan was built on speed and surprise, and at first it worked. German forces poured into northern France, defeating French and British troops in a series of fast-moving battles. By early September, they were within striking distance of Paris, but their advance had stretched supply lines and created gaps between armies. Meanwhile, the French army, battered but still intact, prepared to make a stand. With intelligence gained from aerial reconnaissance and intercepted messages, French commander Joseph Joffre saw an opportunity to counterattack. Alongside the British Expeditionary Force under Sir John French, the French army launched a surprise offensive against the exposed flank of the advancing Germans. Beginning on September 5th, over 1 million soldiers clashed along a broad front near the Marne River. The fighting was chaotic and often close range, as neither side had fully adapted to the scale and lethality of modern warfare. French taxis famously ferried reinforcements from Paris to the front, a symbolic moment showing the capital's determination to resist. As pressure mounted on the German lines, their commanders recognized the growing risk of encirclement and issued a general retreat. By September 12th, the German armies had withdrawn northward, abandoning the hopes of a quick victory. Paris was saved, and the Western Front stabilized. But with neither side able to deliver a decisive blow, the war shifted into a grim new phase. Both sides began digging trenches, and what was supposed to be a short conflict turned into a prolonged stalemate stretching across hundreds of miles. The First Battle of the Marne didn't end the war. It transformed it. It was the moment that Europe realized that old strategies no longer matched the scale of industrialized warfare. The romanticism of swift campaigns gave way to barbed wire, mud, and artillery barrages. For the next 4 years, the war would grind on with unimaginable human cost, all because of the failure to finish it at the Marne.
The Battle of Stalingrad was the ultimate turning point of World War II in Europe, a clash of ideologies, strategies, and sheer human will that ended Hitler's dreams of conquering the Soviet Union. By 1942, Germany had advanced deep into Soviet territory. Confident after swift victories in the West and early success in the East, Hitler launched a new offensive aimed at capturing oil fields in the Caucasus. But for symbolic and strategic reasons, he diverted resources towards seizing the city named after his greatest enemy, Stalin himself. Stalingrad, a major industrial center on the Volga River, became the focus of one of the most intense urban battles in history. Beginning in August 1942, the German Sixth Army, supported by aerial bombardment, began a grinding advance into the city. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. But what looked like an easy victory soon devolved into a brutal street-by-street struggle. Soviet defenders under General Vasily Chukov held on tenaciously, using the ruins to their advantage. Snipers, booby traps, and close-quarters combat turned every building into a battlefield. As the Germans pushed forward, they stretched their flanks thin, guarded only by under-equipped Allied forces from Italy, Romania, and Hungary. Soviet commanders Zhukov and Vasilevsky saw an opportunity. In November 1942, they launched Operation Uranus, a massive counteroffensive aimed not at the city itself, but at the weaker forces surrounding it. The trap closed quickly. Within days, over 250,000 Axis troops were encircled in and around Stalingrad. Hitler refused to allow a retreat. Supplies were dropped by air, but it wasn't enough. The Sixth Army, once a feared force, began to starve and freeze in the Russian winter. By early 1943, the situation had become hopeless. On February 2nd, the remaining German forces surrendered. An entire army was lost. Stalingrad wasn't just a military defeat. It was a psychological collapse for the Third Reich. For the first time, Hitler's invincibility had been shattered. Across the world, morale shifted. The Soviets would now push westward with growing confidence, reclaiming territory and eventually reaching Berlin itself. The cost was immense. Millions of soldiers and civilians were caught in the maelstrom. But the outcome reshaped the trajectory of the war and proved that even the most brutal machine could be turned back by determination, sacrifice, and strategic brilliance.
The Battle of Midway in 1942 was the Pacific War's turning point, a sudden reversal that halted Japanese expansion and gave the United States the momentum it needed to take the offensive. Just 6 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan had carved out a vast empire across the Pacific, seemingly unstoppable. Confident after a string of victories, Japanese planners set their sights on Midway Atoll, a small but strategic outpost halfway between Asia and North America. Capturing it would not only extend Japan's reach, but also draw out and destroy what remained of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. What Japan didn't know was that American codebreakers had cracked their communications. U.S. Navy intelligence, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, discovered the plan to attack Midway and prepared an ambush. Admiral Chester Nimitz gathered a smaller fleet,
including 3 aircraft carriers, and positioned them northeast of the island, waiting for the Japanese strike force to arrive. On June 4th, Japanese aircraft bombed Midway, unaware that U.S. carriers were already in the area. As Japanese carriers prepared to launch a second wave, American aircraft launched desperate attacks. At first, these failed to land any hits, but the Japanese decks were now crowded with fueled planes and loaded bombs, completely vulnerable. At that precise moment, U.S. dive bombers from the carrier Enterprise arrived overhead. In the span of just 5 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were set ablaze and rendered useless. A fourth, Hiryu, launched a brief counterattack that damaged the U.S. carrier Yorktown, but was itself located and destroyed later that day. By the battle's end, Japan had lost 4 carriers, hundreds of aircraft, and many of its most experienced pilots. Midway didn't end the war in the Pacific, but it decisively ended Japan's ability to fight it on the same scale. The industrial might of the United States would soon produce ships, planes, and trained pilots at an unmatched pace. From this point forward, Japan would be on the defensive, slowly losing territory as American forces pushed island by island toward the Japanese mainland. Strategically brilliant and daring in execution, the Battle of Midway remains one of the greatest naval victories in history, not just for its outcome, but how it completely reversed the balance of power in the Pacific.
The Tet Offensive in 1968 shattered the illusion of progress in the Vietnam War and marked a psychological turning point that changed American public opinion forever. Up until that moment, U.S. officials had assured the public that victory was near. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong were described as weakened, demoralized, and incapable of major operations. But then came Tet, the Vietnamese Lunar New Year, and with it, a massive, coordinated assault that proved those assumptions disastrously wrong. In the early hours of January 30th, during what was supposed to be a ceasefire for the holiday, tens of thousands of communist fighters launched attacks across South Vietnam. Over 100 cities and towns were hit simultaneously, including major targets like Saigon, Hue, and Da Nang. The scale of the operation stunned American and South Vietnamese forces. In Saigon, Viet Cong troops stormed the U.S. Embassy compound and held it briefly, sending shockwaves through televisions across the United States. Though tactically the offensive was a failure for North Vietnam, most of the attacks were repelled, and their losses were immense. The political impact was devastating for the U.S. mission. The perception that the enemy was on the ropes vanished overnight. News footage of fierce street battles, destruction in urban centers, and stunned American troops contradicted everything Washington had claimed. The ancient city of Hue became the site of one of the offensive's longest and bloodiest battles. It took nearly a month for U.S. and South Vietnamese forces to retake it, house by house. The prolonged urban combat and reports of mass executions carried out by communist forces deepened the sense of chaos and despair. Back in the United States, public confidence in the war collapsed. Television networks broadcasted uncensored scenes of fighting, civilian suffering, and the harsh realities of a war many had been told was nearing conclusion. Journalists and citizens alike began to question the entire rationale for the conflict. Political support eroded. President Lyndon B. Johnson, deeply shaken by the shift in public mood, soon announced he would not seek re-election. The Tet Offensive didn't end the war, but it cracked the political foundation that supported it. For North Vietnam, the offensive had been a gamble that cost lives, but it succeeded in undermining American resolve. It revealed that in modern warfare, perception can matter as much as battlefield results. And it proved that even a military superpower can lose control of the narrative. The Battle of Fallujah in 2004 was the most intense urban combat fought by U.S. forces since Vietnam and became the defining confrontation of the Iraq War. Located just 40 miles west of Baghdad, Fallujah had become a stronghold for insurgents, foreign fighters, and extremist groups after the fall of Saddam Hussein's regime. Its strategic position, combined with its deeply anti-coalition sentiment, turned the city into a symbol of resistance and a flashpoint that neither the Iraqi government nor the U.S. military could afford to ignore. The situation escalated in March 2004 when 4 American private security contractors were ambushed, killed, and publicly displayed in Fallujah. The images, broadcast globally, triggered outrage in the United States and led to a call for a decisive response. An initial offensive, Operation Vigilant Resolve, was launched in April, but international criticism, political pressure, and mounting civilian casualties forced U.S. forces to withdraw before taking full control. Insurgents interpreted the retreat as a victory. By November 2004, a second offensive, Operation Phantom Fury, was planned with overwhelming force and precision. Over 10,000 U.S. Marines, soldiers, and Iraqi troops surrounded the city, aiming to break the insurgent hold once and for all. This time, there would be no pause. The battle began with airstrikes and artillery bombardments, targeting defensive positions and safe houses. Then, ground troops moved in, block by block. The fighting was brutal and close. Insurgents had prepared extensively, setting traps, rigging buildings, and using underground tunnels for movement. Every house was a potential ambush. Marines had to clear rooms manually, often under heavy fire. Snipers from both sides turned rooftops and windows into deadly zones. Fallujah's dense layout and rubble-strewn streets made tanks and armored vehicles difficult to maneuver, forcing reliance on infantry. After weeks of relentless combat, coalition forces seized control of the city. Most of the insurgent leadership had either been eliminated or fled. The cost, however, was high. Significant American casualties, thousands of insurgents neutralized, and large portions of the city left in ruins. Civilian displacement was massive, and reconstruction would take years. Fallujah became a symbol of the new type of warfare the 21st century would demand: urban, irregular, and politically charged. It demonstrated the limits of conventional power in unconventional settings, and the difficulty of winning both militarily and morally in environments where every neighborhood could be a battlefield.